How you doing, Shasta College? How are everyone doing in the middle of the week? It is Wednesday, and we're moving right along. Not that much further to the end of the course, so we've got a lot of grounds to cover, and it'll be more modern films, which I'm sure you'll be happy about. But what today and for the next couple lectures, I'm going to be talking about genres, specifically certain genres like westerns, sci-fi, rom-coms. Do you have a favorite genre? Um, and the genre I'm going to talk about today, and because it's coming up on Halloween, is horror films. So there's going to be a discussion. I'll post it later. Why horror? Why are people drawn to horror films? Are you drawn to horror films? Do you have a relationship with horror films? Do you distinguish horror from terror? Uh, do you distinguish psychological from slasher? Um, what makes a good horror movie? The mystery or the adrenaline pumping terror of being chased by a guy in a ski mask, hockey mask, a shark in the water, or psychological horror of somebody who's possessed by the devil, perhaps, or by alien abduction, or just plain crazy, like in Psycho, Hitchcock's Psycho. So, horror covers a lot of elements. What makes a good horror movie? Well, did you see the recent horror film Get Out? Very effective, um, very effective horror film, contemporary horror film that also did well at the box office. Why do you think they do well at the box office? What is their fascination with horror? And why doesn't it ever go out of style? Although sometimes it does. I would say um, certain times in our country when things are going a certain way, horror films diminish. Um, that documentary I asked you to watch, I did the quiz on, one of the biggest box office hits of that era, the 70s era, was 1973's The Exorcist. Here we have all these socially relevant films like Five Easy Pieces and Easy Rider and The Graduate. And in the middle of all that, here comes a horror film based on a possession of a 12-year-old girl based on a best-selling novel. And it swept the country. We'd never seen anything like that before. Have you seen The Exorcist with Linda Blair? I think it holds up really well to this day. It's 50 years old. Nobody wants to be possessed by a demon, especially when they put the demon in the body of a child. Child in danger is even worse. That film was truly horrifying when it came out in 1973. People were so shocked that they supposedly, it could be an urban myth, had professional medical personnel on duty when they were showing the film because people were supposedly passing out and fainting. I saw that film when it first came out and it was terrifying. Never forgot it. I actually read the book also because my girlfriend at the time loved that genre of horror. It didn't, the book was truly horrifying. If you think the movie's horrifying, read the novel. It's like the movie on steroids. Peter Blatty, who wrote that book, must have led a very weird life for that year. It took him to write that, to get inside the head of the devil or Satan possessing the body of a child must have been a very dark path to go as a creative writer. Maybe you've done some creativity, maybe you've written something, or can you imagine living with that day in and day out as you try to create those vivid characters? And there is a cost in horror. The girl who starred in it, Linda Blair, it affected her probably for the rest of her life. It affected her career, that's for sure. People didn't really accept her in other roles, um, and that role is essentially what she's still known for. Now, when you make a movie like that with a child, and it was very graphic, sexually graphic and verbally graphic. Well, there has to be uh, parental guidance. There has to be the parents on the set, and also they send in um, the people who protect children in certain movies that they're not supposed to be exposed to things, and then to try and make her feel that she's okay, and it's all a big fun and game. But it was horrifying, terrifying experience for Linda Blair. You can watch her interviews of the movie. Um, they literally put the entire cast and crew through hell, and it was supposedly cursed production. One of the main actors died and was replaced by another actor, so the people felt it was the subject matter that was cursing the movie. William Friedkin, who had the year before had directed a very, very successful movie called um, oh, come on. So successful, I've forgotten the title of it. It was huge, successful crime movie with Gene Hackman, Ray Schreider. I'll come up with it in a second. Um, and then all of a sudden he did this thing, which was a horror film. And that was I'm going to look it up right now because it's really frustrating that I can't come up with that title. Really, it was one of the most famous titles of the '70s on a blockbusters scale. Um, hmm, this is ridiculous. Anyway, it was a big blockbuster crime novel um, based on a real book. Um, the French Connection. Really stupid. I couldn't come up with that. It was such a big movie during the time of the 1970s. Is that the era that we're still working in with your quiz, that documentary? I They had stuff about The Exorcist, but not much stuff about um, when Friedkin's other movies from his career. He directed one of my favorite movies called Boys in the Band, um, which is about a party of gay men getting drunk and getting brutally honest with each other during the party, based on a best-selling play by Mert Crowley. Um, Maybe you've heard of it. And then he did The French Connection, and then all of a sudden he did this movie, which was out of left field. But he's a very versatile director. He's still out there. He's well into his 80s now, so the output of films has slowed. But anyway, horror films. Why did we go back and see that movie over and over again. I think I saw it once, possibly twice. I have no desire to see it again. I don't want to have nightmares. It gave people nightmares. That's how powerful it was. And here we are in a cynical world where we've seen everything. We've gone through the Vietnam War. We've gone through Charles Manson and real serial killers. But then this thing shows up, and possession by the devil was something we weren't used to, and it was a psychological horror film of the highest order. And because it was about a child, it upped the ante of the horror. Before that, we had monster movies in the 30s: Frankenstein, Dracula, The Mummy, The Werewolf. They were frightening, but they were happening to other people, not to the common person, and not to a child either. And we could deal with a monster, but how do you deal with a child who's possessed by the devil? It's a little different. There were some popular films at the time, like The Omen, and later on Poltergeist, which came out in the 80s, which dealt with innocent children again, which is makes us all feel vulnerable. Um, then also in the 50s, we had sci-fi horror, usually started by our fear of atomic fallout, the communist witch hunt, and those movies were very popular in the 60s. Horror kind of dropped off. Roger Corman, who's mentioned in that documentary, produced a series of films based on the Edgar Allan Poe novels, but they're not kind of, they were tongue in cheek. And so you didn't really take it too serious, but they were fun. I'm not saying they're horrifying, but they're definitely fun. Um, so we in the 60s we had silly TV shows like The Munsters, which was fun but not really horrifying. And then we had Adam's Family, which has a darker edge to it, and based on popular uh, animated animation. And they're still doing. They've got a remake coming on Netflix called Wednesday. It actually looks pretty good. It's more comical. It's a black comedy. Wednesday's now a teenage girl. If you know anything about the Addams Family, there's the small child Wednesday. Now she's kind of grown up and going to high school, going to a boarding school far away, and she's still got dark sensibilities. It's helped created by Tim Burton, so that's a good source. But his films are satires, really, of horror, like Edward Scissorhands and Ed Wood, about the low budget filmmaker. Um, but he's kind of dwelled into this gothic horror genre for many years. So his films all have a certain look, a certain feel to them, even to the musical Sweeney Todd with Johnny Depp. But there is a tongue-in-cheek element, satire element to it. Um, he's definitely winking at the audience. Don't take this too seriously. Um, One of my, I think, most important horror films that came about was about 1965. It's called The Haunting, based on the novel by Shirley Jackson called The Haunting of Hill House. It's about some people who spend a weekend in a supposedly haunted house, isolated from everybody else, and they were going to study the phenomenon of ghosts or ghost presence. Um, Julie Harris stars as the very sensitive woman who becomes essentially possessed by evil spirits in this house. It's really truly psychological horror film. You don't see any blood. You don't see anybody killings. Nothing. Nobody's chasing anybody with a knife. There's no sharks after you. They're just simply in a house that is needs to be burned down. Essentially, um, when that movie came out, I convinced my parents that it was okay for me to see it. This is before They had the strict rating system into effect, and I was too young to see it, and it gave me nightmares for many, many years. Um, it's that effective. I got to meet the director later on when I was a filmmaker myself, Robert Wise, um, who directed The Sound of Music, believe it or not, and the Day the Earth Stood Still. He did sci-fi. He did musicals. He did horror. He also edited Citizen Kane and The Magnificent Ambersons. So his filmmaking knew no genre that he couldn't direct. Um, Beautiful haunted house movie of the highest order with homoerotic symbolism all over it. Simply, if you saw Persona, I hope you watched it and enjoyed it. There is definite homoerotic happenings in that film. They don't act on it, but we see it. There's the two women are getting very intimate with each other. Well, in this, there's two women, and there's obviously something going on there also. But there's before that everything's so blatant now. They show everything, they explain everything, but you had to look at the subliminal symbolisms of two women who might be attracted to each other sexually. It was dangerous grounds. In 1962, there was a low budget movie made for $20,000-$30,000 only. It's called Carnival of Souls. You can watch it on YouTube. It's out there. Unknown actors, you won't know anybody, about a woman who cheats death. And for the rest of the movie, something's wrong. She keeps seeing what she calls ghouls that keep beckoning her in her dreams, in her waking dreams. She's not asleep all the time. And she's drawn to this carnival out in the middle of nowhere. They filmed it out by Salt Lake City, Utah. And the Carnival of Lost Souls it's full of essentially dead people. They're not zombies. They're not attacking other people. Nobody else sees them because they are deceased. She sees them because, well, at the very end of the movie, you find out she's really dead. And so it's got a twist at the end. The woman who stars in it is still alive. She goes on the lecture circuit. She's well into her 80s. And it's still that film has become a cult horror film that many critics think is in the top 100 of effective horror movies. The Carnival of Souls. Yes, filmed in glorious black and white, 1962. The acting is pretty amateur. The woman is really good, and it's very effective. So then we go into the 70s, and we don't have much besides The Exorcist, which was huge box office success. I guess we'd like to be scared. Um, the 80s had kind of comical horror movies like Goonies and Gremlins. All those things, they weren't too horrifying, not too, but they made money at the box office, but they were kind of satires on horror. Uh, but there were some really horror films that came out of the 70s and 80s, like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Last House on the Left, which is truly psychologically horrifying. Um, Also, a genre of movies, subgenre of the horror movie would be the teenagers going out into the woods to party and to have sex in the cabin, and they're all slaughtered out there in the cabin. Don't go out in the cabin, folks, with your friends and with a bunch of booze and have sex. You will be punished for your deeds. There's very many of these movies that did the same sort of um, themes and imagery of the isolated cabin. A great one that's really really fantastically directed by Sam Raimi. The Evil Dead 2 and 3 are both. Evil Dead 2's even better. Uh, about the cabin out in the woods and what evil crap happens out there in the woods when you're isolated. This is before cell phones. There's nobody trying to. You can't get any cell phone reception out there. There's just evil stuff happening in the dark woods. Very effective. Evil Dead's got a huge sense of humor, and so you see the horror, but then you get laugh, and so it relieves the tension. And I think that's important to relieve the tension. Steve Spielberg knows how to do that, and Jaws is classic. Alfred Hitchcock. You show something, you have creepy music, you have something you think ominous camera work, and you expect something bad to happen, and then there's a joke, and then the people in the movie actually laugh, and then there's like a relief and a release. But then 1 second later, the real horror happens. So he lets you off the hook just for a moment. That's clever directing that Spielberg picked up from the masters, people like Alfred Hitchcock, who directed a lot of um, those psychological horror movies like Psycho, about the woman who who steals the money and then tries to escape, spends the night in a hotel. She picks the wrong hotel to stay at. And the guy who runs the hotel, Norman Bates, is essentially a serial killer. And at night, he dresses up like his mother, who's mummified, living up in his upstairs room. And of course, when she takes the famous shower sequence, he stabs her to death. And after that sequence, nobody wanted to take a shower again. Just like Jaws, nobody went into the ocean for many years after they saw Jaws. When the music starts, the camera starts moving, we don't need to see anything. We know some bad stuff is going to happen. And that's effective horror. Hitchcock went on to do The Birds and then psychological horror like Rear Window and Vertigo. But his crowning achievement horror wise was probably Psycho. But he also directed a very, not directed, but he created and hosted a very clever episodic television series called the Alfred Hitchcock Hour, which was all full of these dark, macabre stories. Not as clever as Twilight Zone, but equally as effective. And he hosted the show every day, week rather, and he was a comical presence. His droll delivery, so we kind of were laughing at Alfred Hitchcock as is this eccentric character, but his movies are very, very effective. He wasn't laughing when he was making his movies, but he obviously had a really dark sense of humor. So then we got those three. The Haunting I talked about. What's the show examples? Oh yeah, Japanese horror is another. Horror is popular around the world. Depends on what the cultural background is of the horror. Japan has a lot of horror. Uh, we dropped, the United States dropped 2 atom bombs on Japan. They lived through the horror of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and World War II. Yes, they were our enemy and uh, did the sneak attack on Pearl Harbor, and we bombed them into oblivion. And for years, that resonated with illness and people having deformities because of the radiation. And so horror coming out of these countries is based in real life horror, um, which we really don't really have in this country because nobody's besides 9/11 and a few terrorist things. We have never been attacked or bombed here in this country, and so we don't have that horror based on, but we have horror, persecution, slavery, class distinctions. Now we have the horror of politics. Anyway, so every Japan has some incredible, disturbing horror films. I'm going to show a clip of one for you guys to look at. The Audition. It's probably rated X if it has a rating, about these guys who fake like they're going to make a movie, but they're not. They're just trying to have sex with women, and they audition these women, and one of them finds out they're not really doing a movie. It's all faked, and boy, does she get revenge. Very disturbing. Um, Korea has put out some incredible horror films in the last couple of years. Old Boy is one of them. Maybe you've seen it. Recently, they won an Academy Award for a horror film called Parasite. And it was a horror film, a modern take on horror, filmed in glorious black and white, by the way. So then there's the slasher movies. There's Jason chasing people with a ski mask. There's Freddy, who gets you when you go to sleep and he attacks you in your nightmares. Um, there's Michael from the Halloween. These are different. The horror isn't psychological. I mean, being chased is obviously horrible, but it's more adrenaline based, and it's more terrifying because they're being chased and terrorized by a living human being, not Freddy. He's a spirit, a dead spirit, but you can't fight back. Whereas in psychological horror, how do you fight back uh, mental illness or the devil or a demon? That's a little harder to fight. You have to be a little more cunning to fight that. And it's a little bit more mysterious and horrifying because it could happen to anybody, supposedly. So Halloween is on us. Think about this. Start a discussion. I'll post it up there today. Why horror? Why are we attracted to horror? And if you have a personal story about horror movies, share it. That'll be in discussion. I'll sign a paper probably tomorrow. I'm not sure what yet. It might be a horror film. Maybe it will be a horror film. Um, and we'll keep moving on and upward. On that happy note, Halloween's coming. And so, welcome to Fright Night.